Hey there, I just wanted to take a few minutes and go over some details of some projects that have been bouncing around in my head where I really wanted to experiment and learn a lot more about several different things. And it all really stems from this basic concept of something I was tinkering around with at work to solve some problems regarding Walmart and working with some report information that they provide. Walmart in particular, the way they operate their fiscal calendar every year, it starts basically the week of February 1st every year, and from that point forward they have a special Walmart week that they assign all their sales data to. And this Walmart week number, it's off from a normal calendar date, so that can make things a little tricky when trying to ingest Walmart reporting data and trying to match it up to a real calendar so that other data from different sources could be connected up to it, and it all kind of makes sense as far as the same time period goes. So, long story short, I had a problem that needed some custom code created, and that code was built to convert a Walmart week date format to a normal calendar date, as well as vice versa. Take a normal calendar date and determine what the current Walmart week is for that date. So I spent a little time already and built a library, but in my mind, my end goal was to create a web API that we could use on my team or anywhere in the public, for example, if there were other people that had this problem of trying to convert the Walmart week to a normal calendar date and vice versa. So what I'm showing here on the screen is that final result. I have a web API where I made a request to convert a date format from the Walmart week style into the normal calendar date. So before I really get too deep into that, I want to rewind and really start from the beginning on how I got here to this point, because there were many steps involved in that process. So I'm going to just switch over to my Visual Studio Code and pull up what I've created as my Walmart week lib project. This is the core concept of what my problem is and how I solved it. I created a PHP library to provide a couple methods. It's just one class with two functions or two methods within it. One to convert a date to a Walmart week format. And now I keep saying Walmart week format, and just know that's a 4-digit year and a 2-digit week number. But that week number, again, it doesn't match up with what the world's week number is. It'll be off by a few. So just keep that in mind whenever I'm talking about Walmart weeks. So I can convert to a Walmart week from whatever date, and I can convert to a date from any Walmart week. And then I just put in a little helper method in here just for good measure to get the current Walmart week. But the real meat of this library is happening in these two functions. So with that, in order to really make sure that this thing was working, I created some unit tests to just run through some functions and pass some known values to make sure I'm getting what I expect. Really, that's really the goal of a unit test, is I want to discretely test some input and make sure the output matches what I expect. If not, then alert me, because there's probably a bug in my code. So here's just an example of those unit tests where I'm taking just a few dates over the last few years and converting them to Walmart weeks, or taking Walmart weeks from various years and converting them to their calendar dates. So I know that my functionality is working properly just by running my unit tests. And you can see in my Visual Studio Code or VS Code, I personally like to keep a terminal window open because there's usually some kind of commands I want to run. In this case, I want to run PHP unit manually, and I'm going to kick that off basically through Composer and tell it to run everything in my tests folder, which we can see there's this tests folder here. So when I run that, everything runs. There's 7 tests. They all passed just fine. So according to my expectations in the tests, the Walmart Week library is performing as expected. So that right there, I could have just left it there and been done with this and moved on. But I really wanted to take this concept a lot farther, like I said in the beginning of this video. So really to kind of kick that off, after getting this core concept of the library and the unit tests in place, for good measure, I got this code up on our company GitHub page in case there might be some other PHP programmer out there that happens to want to use this functionality in their project. I just wanted to get this published. So we can see it's got its own repository and a nice little README here. And I kind of want to dig into a few other things that I added to this to really help with that learning process and reinforce some ideas. So one thing, personally, I use Composer very frequently to pull in packages with existing functionality so I can incorporate that into my project and not necessarily have to reinvent the wheel all the time. In this case of the library project, I did that here by requiring, just for development purposes, that I have PHP unit installed. But beyond that, I've also filled in a little bit of extra information here so that I could publish this Walmart Week library, to Packagist so that others could easily find it in the world. So with that composer.json file in place and in my repository and added to the project, you can see here it is in the repo. One step I had to do was I had to make a release in the GitHub project, and with that release in place, I could go over to Packagist and submit the project. Well, here it is. It was received and has been crawled and is now a part of Packagist. So if somebody was searching for white spider libraries, now you can find the Walmart Week library. So that's cool, making some progress on some of that kind of open source type of expectation there. But taking it even further from there, I really wanted to push myself just for something to get myself a little more familiar with the build process on a PHP script. Just as a side note, I do have experience with build processes in my .NET days from several years ago, and it made a little more sense there with ASP.NET since everything gets compiled into basically binary files in addition to some HTML and CSS. Well, I really wanted to learn more about that process in the PHP world, so I've connected this project up to Travis CI, or Travis Continuous Integration. It's a service that's available for free for one open source project. The Travis CI system will monitor the repo on GitHub and detect any changes. When those changes occur, it will execute a script known as a build script that I've configured. If I go back into my VS Code for the library project, I've got this .travis YAML file, and the Travis CI system it won't do anything until this file exists in the project. And all it is just, you can see it's only 4 lines of code here. We're saying I've got a PHP language project. I'm targeting PHP 5.6, and the script I want you to run in order to confirm if we have a good build or not is run PHP unit tests. So one thing about Travis is when you're doing a PHP based build script, you're getting PHP unit as a part of their process automatically. So just like how on my machine locally I showed you I could run PHP unit and execute my tests, I'm basically running the same thing in a much simpler syntax on the Travis CI build servers. So assuming all those tests pass on Travis's system, just like this, we see the 7 successful dots, then I will continue to have a build passing badge show up in my README file here. So that concept right there of just trying to isolate the core library functionality was really the first step I wanted to take in executing this bigger end goal of trying to create a web API. So here in just a moment, we'll go to the next phase of this project. Okay, so now the next part of this is I wanted to take the library that I created from the first step and really start to encapsulate that into a web API. So what I did was I utilized the SLIM framework for PHP, and let me just pull that up. SLIM framework. So here on the SLIM website, slimframework.com, we can see it's a micro framework for PHP, and this thing is really awesome. You can just include it through a composer requirement, and it's going to create a lot of plumbing code on your behalf to really get up and running very quickly with creating a simple RESTful interface. And so even though I say simple, there's a lot that you can do with this, but if you're looking for something down and dirty, so to speak, SLIM is a very quick way to get up and running. So jumping back into VS Code, I use the SLIM framework skeleton website generator to really stub out a core basic project here, and that really got me about 90% of the way of where I needed to be with what I was trying to accomplish. So SLIM, it generated a lot of folders, and there's a lot of PHP in here and a few other miscellaneous files, but really the core extra 10% that I had to do on top of the skeleton project was through Composer. Now that, because of my first step of this project, I published the library into Packagist, I could now require my White Spider Walmart Week lib project into any other project I want, this being the first project. So my SLIM project is now utilizing the functionality created from that library project. With that in place, I was able to create some routes to implement the 2 functions in my library code. One being to convert to a Walmart week from a date, as well as convert to a date from a Walmart week. So there's these two methods, or 2 routes, excuse me, available that would be accessible over HTTP, so I can start making some programmatic API requests. So SLIM, it's ready to go. If I jump back to my browser, and if I want to start testing this, I might go to localhost. Well, in this case, my local host isn't up and running But the really nice thing, really awesome thing that the folks at SLIM did is they've included some basic functionality so that you can start using SLIM via Docker on your local development machine. And they do that with a process or with a file called the Docker Compose file. So in my experience so far, this is really just the Docker Compose method really just seems to be appropriate for development. There's not a lot going on here to really dig into other than when I boot up this image, we're going to create a PHP 7 environment and open up a simple web server mapped to port 8080, and that's it. So if I run that, jump down into my console, let's see here. Need to be in the right directory there. So I have a little alias. D up is really running Docker Compose up minus D. So we're saying, hey, Docker Compose program, we want to start up an image and put it in daemon mode so it runs in the background. So now I can go back to my local host, and in this case I need to go to port 8080. I get page not found, which is fine because I don't have a route set up for the home page. But if I do go to a to or from directory and pass a parameter, I can start to get some values here. So if I pass in, I want the Walmart week for today, October the 13th. Well, I passed in one date, and it's also just including it in the results here just for good measure. But the week that goes with this date, you can see is 2018-38. Okay, so my to route is working, and if we do the same thing on the from, now you can see I want to see what's the date from 2019 week 26. We can see that that's the week of July 20th, 2019. So far, so good. So Docker Compose has really helped get this SLIM framework up and running. So with very little effort, you can get a really awesome little development environment going and an infrastructure in place for a RESTful API between SLIM and Docker Compose. So those were a couple really powerful things to make the second step of the project go pretty well. So here in just a moment we'll go on to the next phase, which is really digging more into Docker. Okay, so now just before we get into more Docker, I want to show really kind of to prove and illustrate the point of going from this Docker Compose environment to a Docker image environment. And for starters, we can quickly verify that just by looking at the network request headers. So if I just refresh this page, and I've inspected the page, I'm looking at the network tab, and I can look at the request and response headers. We can see that in the response headers to my little endpoint, you can see that this is powered by PHP 7.2. There's no web server, no Nginx, no Apache in here. Well, that's because in my Docker Compose file provided by SLIM, that's all we're running. We're just running a little PHP 7 environment and using PHP's built-in web server functionality. So this is the development environment. There's no web server. Well, in the Docker image environment, there will be a web server. So, which leads me to really the point of this third phase of the project. I wanted to really sink my teeth into utilizing Docker for more than just local development. I really wanted to see the power of using Docker to create a custom image that contains my application code that could be then stored in our private Docker registry, or really any registry, and then consumed by some kind of a cloud hosting service. In this case, we're going to see Azure a little bit down the road. But that concept, I want to package code, bundle it up in an image file so that I can just send it anywhere, and I know that as long as the hosting environment supports Docker, it just needs to run my image. It doesn't need to worry about what PHP version, what's the configuration of PHP, what web server do I need to use, what's the configuration of that server, any of that stuff. All that's happening here. This is the core concept of infrastructure as code. I don't have to be a Linux sysadmin or some DevOps person to get in and do a bunch of configuration necessarily if I can understand how to build a Docker image file. Now, just to be clear, this Docker file is different than the Docker Compose. The Docker Compose is pretty simple to get up and running, and it has a YAML syntax to it, but both files, well, maybe the Docker file isn't a YAML file per se, but they're both very simple syntaxes. But again, the Docker Compose is really utilizing somebody else's image to just run almost like a virtual machine on your development computer. But the Docker file itself is going to create its own image that will contain all my code here for this SLIM API project and bundle that up and send it out into the world. So in order to do that, I did piggyback off somebody else's project. Starting from the top, I'm starting from this other Docker image that's basically an instance of Ubuntu with Apache 2 and PHP 7.1. So that's my server environment that this SLIM API project is going to run in, on regardless of what the Docker hosting environment is actually running under the surface. The environment my application is going to run in is Ubuntu with Apache 2 and PHP 7.1. So the next line is my maintainer information, just some basic contact details. Now the rest of this is really the good stuff, where we're starting to build a custom bundle. So we're starting with Ubuntu, but with that, we're going to copy my app folder into the Docker image server var www folder. So we can see that means take this app folder from my development machine and store it in the Docker image in this directory var www. The next step is we're going to move a couple files around because this SLIM project works out of a public folder by default. I've just added a couple simple commands to move the contents of the public folder into the var www HTML folder, because this HTML folder is really the default web root within this image that I'm basing everything off of. I've got the index file that's being moved and the htaccess file that's being moved. So that means once this image is up and running and I go to that Docker image in my browser, it's going to execute the index file. The next line here is setting an environment variable in the htaccess file so that SLIM can detect that we're running in Docker mode versus development mode. And the reason for that is this concept that I'm still learning more about myself, but with Docker images, it seems to be a best practice to avoid logging requests into files on the file system. Now, for local development, that's fine, and SLIM operates that way. But when I publish this application to a Docker hosting environment, and maybe I need to scale this up and have multiple instances of this API running in different clusters or whatever to handle a huge load of all the people that would be using this theoretical API. I don't want log information getting lost in a file on a file system. So what happens is I've got this little switch in place to tell Monolog, a library that comes packaged within SLIM, hey, if we're in Docker mode, send your output to standard output or std out rather than the logs app log file. So this will help for Docker-based log monitoring processes and applications. We'll be able to get any information coming out of my SLIM app into standard output into one of those logging applications so that it could be read across any number of Docker hosting machines. So going back to my Docker file, that was the set env or set environment line that we were just looking at. And then the next few lines below that are a couple, 3 tweaks to some processes running on the target image here, this Ubuntu machine, to really make sure that the output from my application does truly get sent to standard output. The last line here, expose 80, is basically, hey, expose your Docker image machine's port 80 to be available to the hosting machine's port 80. So, like I showed you a few minutes ago, we are running localhost port 8080. I made a request and I got a response just from PHP with no web server. Okay, but now if I shut down my Docker Compose version of Docker, then I can boot up my Docker image version of this application, and conveniently within VS Code, I believe it's just default, there's a little Docker icon in here to get into the Docker view, and there's a lot going on in here when you've got everything all set up and you've got images going. So basically I have a container here that is this Docker image that I built, and if I restart the container, see the light went green there, the little icon went green. I can do Docker PS, and we can see that Walmart Week API is up and running. It's been up for 5 seconds. And now, if I go back to my browser, I'm going to take off the port 8080, make a request, okay, and then it doesn't look like anything happened. However, when I look at my details here in my response headers, now look at this. We see that this response, the request and response, was fulfilled by Apache 2 on Ubuntu. So this is really showing you that the Docker image of this project is now running my code. So you can think about this Docker image or container as almost like a zip file that says, hey, here's my operating system details, my application configuration, and my custom web app code. Take this and run it. So it really tries to simplify this concept of getting code up and running in any environment. So now with that in place, I was able to publish the image or the container of this Walmart Week API project into my Docker Hub registry. So this is almost an equivalent to you have your local Git repository on your machine, and you have GitHub to publicly make that code available. Well, I have a Docker image on my machine, and I've published it to a Docker Hub repository. In this case, it's a private repository because I don't necessarily want the world seeing this and using this, in particular Docker image. So I was able to get this published, and if we go into Docker Hub, we can see that in my account that there's a private repo, and that it was created about 4 hours ago in this case. There's one tag, it was tagged as the latest build, and this file is 164 megabytes. So that's the operating system of Ubuntu, Apache 2, PHP, and my SLIM application code and my Walmart Week library, all bundled up into a little 164 meg image that is now pretty much ready to start running in the cloud. So let me pause for a moment, and then we will get to the last step of this project. Okay, so now the final step of this project is to take this Docker image that represents everything about my project and exactly how I want it to run, and then put it in an environment where that will run. In this case, we're going to use Microsoft Azure. So they've got some pretty flexible pricing to get in here and start experimenting with this. And there's some things that are just always free, some of it's paid. There's really a lot to it, and so this is by no means meant to be an Azure tutorial. This is really just trying to show that out of all the services that Microsoft Azure provides, there's one in particular that I wanted to take advantage of, and it's the Function Apps feature. And we can see that I already have one existing function app installed or set up, but in order to kind of back up from there, if I was going to add this or create a new one within the new options that can be serverless function app is what I ran and set up. So let me just kind of go through this, and this might help really solidify why I've done the things that I did in the previous steps. So really, I put in a name, and this name is what will drive the actual URL. So in this case, Walmart Week API. That name is that because that's what I typed in here. Walmart Week API. Now, it's telling me it's already in use, and that's fine. Doing pay as I go, using an existing resource. And now as far as the host operating system, in this case, I'm not building a .NET based application, so I wanted to try Linux. And okay, they will allow you to publish some code, either .NET or JavaScript. Well, I already wrote this library in PHP, so that won't work. So Docker image it is. So I have a service plan, which is basically just where and how this underlying infrastructure is going to be maintained. But the key here is to configure a container. This is how Azure can connect to Docker Hub and log in as me and pull in my project, Walmart Week API, into this new function app. And when I click create, Azure takes a little time to run behind the scenes, download that image, boot it up in its environment, and get it going. And the final result is you've got a functioning app within the Azure environment. And there's all sorts of bells and whistles on features on how you can customize and and put a custom domain and monitor the processes and the number of requests and everything that's happening coming to your API. You can scale up and add more hosting to the underlying infrastructure by clicking a few options, and it's going to replicate your Docker image across those servers. So basically, going through a little pointing and clicking and monitoring, you can scale up, scale down, left or right your API hosting environment without having to get into the nitty-gritty of being a Linux sysadmin. So now you really have to become an Azure admin and understand what's going on. But you're not really having to mess around with the code. You can just focus on the hosting environment side of things. As long as it's going to continue to run the Docker image, everything should be perfectly fine. So the final result of all that was, just like I was showing you in the beginning, we now have this Walmart Week API.azurewebsites.net, where I can execute my to and from endpoints running through the SLIM framework that's making calls to my Walmart Week lib code and returning the results back as a JSON response. And just for good measure, I put together some quick little API tests to make sure that I can convert from dates to weeks and from weeks to dates. So this is apitester.com, and where I have basically two requests that I'm making, and then I'm checking the results of both those requests to make sure the responses match what I expect. In the first case, I'm sending a date and I want to convert it to the week. So I expect a JSON response with a week attribute that contains a value that matches this. My second test is to get a date from a week, and I'm going to send in this week value, and I expect a JSON response with a date attribute that matches this value. If I click test, this process will start running, and after a couple seconds we'll see the results. Okay, so you see just in 5 seconds it made those two requests and checked the responses against the code that's running on Azure. It made that request, it got a response, it passed the test to make sure that I was able to get a week back. It made another request to Azure, and it passed the test to make sure that I got a date back. So there you have it. From PHP library to cloud-based function-as-a-service web API. I hope you've enjoyed this and learned a thing or two, or maybe sparked some new things to think about and investigate yourself. Thanks for watching.